You'd think being the most powerful woman in the world might come with daily baths. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'll show you how a queen cloaked in lace velvet and imperial dignity could still smell like mildew and mothballs beneath it all. Royalty, after all, has never guaranteed cleanliness. A silver basin, half a bar of soap, and attendants with poker faces. This was hygiene at the heart of the British Empire. What was hidden under the tiara? Why did she bathe so rarely? And how did a monarch become a mystery of musk? If this makes your shower routine feel unexpectedly noble, maybe tap, like, and subscribe. No soap needed, just one clean click. Also, if you're listening from bed, tell me what's the strangest fact you've ever learned when you couldn't sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are gliding down the palace halls past portraits and creaking gas lamps toward a room that smells of lavender, and something less lovely. Soap, perhaps, or starch. Perhaps neither. The truth is, Queen Victoria, monarch of a globe-spanning empire, was not overly fond of bathing. In fact, by today's standards, her personal hygiene would raise more than a few royal eyebrows. Historians still debate the exact frequency of her full-body baths, but most agree it was rare. Weekly, doubtful. Monthly, maybe. According to surviving correspondence and the records of her attendants, the Queen favored sponge baths, quick dabs rather than immersive scrubs. Warm water, sometimes infused with herbs, was carefully sponged onto her body by her maids, but full immersion. That was deemed unnecessary or even dangerous for a woman of her station and constitution. There was a peculiar belief during the 19th century, especially among the upper classes, that too much bathing could invite illness. The skin, many thought, served as a delicate barrier not to be overly disturbed. Soap, especially the harsh lye-based soaps of the era, could strip it of vital oils. As a result, many Victorians, including the Queen herself, kept actual washing to a minimum, preferring instead to rely on layers of linen perfume and sheer social confidence to keep unpleasantness at bay. One quirky account from a palace footman described the Queen's personal soap as hard as bone and never smaller. Some suggest this means it was rarely used. Others argue it was simply ceremonial, a symbol of cleanliness, more than a tool for it. There's no scholarly consensus on how often Victoria actually lathered up, but her pristine portraits certainly don't reflect the day-to-day smells of court life. And that's part of the paradox. Outwardly, Queen Victoria projected regality, control, and fastidious order. Inwardly, beneath the corsets and silks, there lurked a very human, very unwashed reality. Some speculate her aversion to bathing came from early childhood illnesses, or a personal discomfort with exposure. Others point to her era's medical advice, which rarely recommended full baths for women. Whatever the cause, the Queen's bathing habits set the tone for court life. Her ladies-in-waiting adopted similarly restrained hygiene routines, and the palace staff, aware of the monarch's sensitivities, took great care not to offend the royal nose with anything too soapy. You pause now in that tiled chamber lit by flickering sconces, and imagine the Queen standing silently as water is dabbed along her shoulders, neither chilled nor warm, but precisely tepid. No splashing, no rinsing. Just the soft whisper of cloth on skin and the rustle of heavy skirts waiting to be redraped. There's something oddly theatrical about a sponge bath, especially when it involves a crown, a screen, and 3 ladies with steady hands. Each morning, before the bustle of court life began, Queen Victoria underwent what was politely termed her toilette. But unlike the full immersions favored in Roman bathhouses or even the hearty copper tub scrubbings of Georgian England, Victoria's hygiene routine remained delicately dry. A modest sponge bath shielded by folding screens and assisted by discreet attendants was the royal standard. You're standing quietly now, just outside her dressing room, where the ritual unfolds with the precision of a military maneuver. First, the basins are filled not too hot, never cold. The towels are warmed by the fire. A sponge round and dense rests in a silver dish beside the queen's favored lotion, floral with notes of bergamot. Her undergarments are laid out like battle armor petticoats, corset chemise stockings. But here's the curious part. Victoria wasn't alone during this ritual, yet privacy was paramount. The room might be full of trusted women, but strict decorum ruled the space. One maid washed the arms, another the back, and a third focused solely on drying. No one ever looked the queen directly in the eye. Conversation, if it occurred, was clipped and impersonal. It was a choreography of modesty, unspoken rules passed down through generations of royal attendants. Some scholars remain puzzled by the contradiction, a queen so powerful, yet so dependent on others for the most intimate acts of self-care. But in the world of monarchs, autonomy often gave way to tradition. Victoria followed the same protocols her mother insisted upon, and her mother before her. Breaking them would have seemed not only rebellious, but unclean in the eyes of the court. And this sponge ritual wasn't just hygienic, it was political. By refusing full immersion, Victoria quietly rejected the French fashion of scented baths and steamy indulgence practices associated with sensuality and moral laxity. Her sponge baths, modest and brief, projected Victorian values, self-restraint order, and a profound discomfort with nudity, even her own. Yet quirks abounded. One lady-in-waiting recalled the queen's insistence that her feet never touch cold tiles. Woolen slippers were slipped on immediately after washing. Another noted how Victoria sometimes murmured to her dogs during the ritual, as if grounding herself in their non-judgmental presence. Historical records do not always agree on the frequency of these sponge baths. Some suggest they occurred daily. Others say they were sporadic, especially during travel or mourning. There is no scholarly consensus, but the rituals themselves, however frequent, were always performed with gravity. A sponge bath was not simply cleaning, it was ceremony. You imagine it now, the splash of warm water, the gentle pat of cloth against flesh, the rustle of skirts behind a screen. Outside, the palace stirs with diplomats and scribes, but here in this hush, Victoria stands nearly still, her world reduced to steam silence, and the steady hand of someone who will never call her by name. You catch the faint scent of mint and soot as a tiny silver pot is uncapped. Toothpaste, if it could be called, that sits inside like a lump of gritty chalk, and someone somewhere is preparing to clean the queen's teeth. Queen Victoria's oral hygiene regimen was not for the squeamish. Today, toothpaste comes in bright plastic tubes and promises everything from whitening to breath freshening. But in the 19th century, things were less pleasant. A popular dentifrice might include crushed charcoal chalk, burnt bread, powdered myrrh, or even brick dust. Royal recipes often mix these with tinctures of clove or peppermint oil, giving the illusion of freshness while grinding away enamel with every scrub. Victoria, however, loathed the entire ordeal. Letters and diaries reveal her deep distrust of dentists and her general discomfort with anything involving her mouth. Brushing often meant little more than dabbing the teeth with a cloth or rubbing them with a finger. Toothbrushes did exist. Of course, boar bristle brushes were available to the wealthy, but many Victorians saw them as too aggressive. And in Victoria's case, reports suggest she tolerated only the softest tools, and not every day. You now peer into her boudoir, where a maid discreetly lays out a miniature dental tray, a soft cloth, a pot of powder, and a cup of tepid water. There's no frothing toothpaste or flashing of pearly whites, just slow, quiet cleaning in small circular motions. The queen would sit nearly upright, her expression tight, and endure the ritual as one might endure a thunderstorm, waiting it out, hoping it ends soon. What's strange is that despite the minimal care, Victoria did not suffer the rampant tooth loss common in her era, at least not publicly. Some scholars continue to debate whether she secretly had dental work done or was simply fortunate in her enamel. A few surviving records mention dental irritation or appointments with a surgeon dentist, but full extractions or dentures are never confirmed. And yet her aversion to dental attention was well known. In one anecdote, a royal physician supposedly offered to examine a toothache and was met with icy silence. The queen apparently preferred suffering in stoic silence over opening her mouth for anyone in a white coat. Quirkier still was her preference for aromatic lozenges, which she believed masked bad breath. These were essentially Victorian breath mints made from sugar rose oil and powdered spices. They were handed out in small tins, sometimes engraved with royal crests and tucked into her reticule when traveling. More comforting than brushing, and certainly less abrasive. There is no scholarly agreement on how seriously the Queen took oral hygiene as she aged. Some reports suggest a decline in dental care in her later years. Others maintain that her attendants maintained the same routine, gently dabbing and polishing as instructed. But everyone agrees she hated it. As you step back from the royal dressing table, you're left with a peculiar image, a ruler of empires squinting with discomfort as chalky powder is dabbed along her gums and a maid gently hums to distract her from the scrape. Step softly now, because what lies ahead isn't a throne room. It's a chamber pot discreetly tucked beneath velvet and lace. Before the advent of indoor plumbing, even royalty had to answer nature's call the old-fashioned way. For Queen Victoria, this meant using a portable toilet, known as a commode chair, often disguised as fine furniture. These devices were carefully placed behind folding screens inside bedchambers, or within lavish dressing rooms always close at hand, but never spoken of in polite company. You pause beside one now, a mahogany stool with ornate legs and an embroidered cushion. But lift the seat and there it is, a ceramic bowl lined with linen and faint traces of lavender sachets. These perfumes weren't just for comfort, they were essential in masking the reality of royal digestion. Royal chamber pots were emptied by footmen or lower-ranking maids who bore the task with both discretion and nostrils clenched. To preserve Victoria's dignity, the act of emptying was done silently, and always when she was out of sight. One account describes attendants wearing gloves and carrying the full pots with both hands as though transporting priceless porcelain. It's easy to imagine the logistical ballet that followed linen cloths, swiftly swapped freshening herbs scattered, and windows opened just wide enough to let air in, but not scandal out. Some researchers debate how many such commodes Victoria had at any given time. There's evidence she traveled with, at least one often disguised in her luggage as an ottoman or side table. Even while visiting Balmoral or Osborne House, her need for consistency and privacy meant these items followed closely behind. Interestingly, there was a belief in the royal household that cold floors could cause illness if one lingered too long. While seated so, thick woolen slippers and heavy rugs were placed near every commode. One footman recorded that a maid was once scolded for letting Victoria's feet touch bare tile during a midnight visit. But it wasn't all solemnity. Letters from her household staff contain hints of dark humor inside jokes about who would win the pot duty on any given day, or wagers placed on which visiting dignitary might mistake the commode for a stool. Still none dared make light of the Queen's own routines. No pipes gurgled, no handles flushed. Waste was carried out manually, often several times a day. The palace's sewage system didn't fully modernize until the very late 19th century, meaning that for most of Victoria's reign, the air within Windsor and Buckingham carried more than the scent of roses. There is still no agreement among historians as to whether Victoria truly understood the full extent of these behind-the-scenes rituals. Some suggest she willfully ignored them. Others believe she appreciated the devotion of those who ensured her comforts remained invisible. So, here you stand beside the most politely concealed item in the palace, imagining the orchestration required to keep a queen's dignity intact. A bowl of porcelain, a flick of perfume, and the quiet exit of a footman pretending not to exist. You hear it before you see it. A soft splash followed by the faint rustle of towels. Behind another heavy door, in a room warm with firelight and lavender oil, Queen Victoria's hair is being washed, rarely. In fact, it was typically done once a month, perhaps even less, depending on travel illness or mourning. For a woman whose likeness adorned coins, statues, and countless portraits, Victoria's relationship with personal grooming was surprisingly sparse. And among all grooming tasks, washing her thick, dark hair ranked among the least frequent and the most logistically complex. Picture it now. The queen seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, her voluminous hair pinned loosely in preparation. A basin rests nearby, as does a ewer filled with warm, rose-scented water. A lady in waiting, sleeves rolled and brow furrowed in concentration, prepares for the task ahead. Washing royal hair was not an art, it was a production. Victoria's hair was her pride. Even as it grayed and thinned with age, she kept it long and often styled in coils or braids beneath her signature widow's cap. But the length made washing cumbersome, and drying it took hours often by the fire or wrapped in linen towels. There were no hair dryers, no shampoos, just soap water, vinegar rinses, and a lot of patience. Some scholars remain divided on who exactly performed the task. While it was typically the duty of a personal maid or dresser, Victoria occasionally insisted that only her most trusted attendant touch her hair. One diary entry even hints that she once allowed her daughter Princess Helena to help, for sentimental reasons though, not with skill. The soaps used were often made from Castile base, heavily perfumed, and considered gentle for the scalp, though by today's standards they'd be harsh and drying. Vinegar rinses were applied to add shine and cut through any lingering oil. Still, without regular washing, buildup was inevitable. Attendants often resorted to brushing scented powders into her scalp. Between washes rose lavender or even orris root to absorb excess oil and add fragrance. There's a soft intimacy in imagining it. The rhythmic motion of fingers through hair, the murmur of court gossip, the crackle of a fireplace. A queen eyes closed briefly at rest, not speaking of empire or marriage politics, but simply allowing herself to be tended. Yet, for all the care, the process was dreaded. Victoria reportedly complained of the water being too sharp, or the rinses cold and disagreeable. She disliked her scalp being touched for too long, and on more than one occasion, the washing was cut short. There is no scholarly consensus as to whether this was due to physical sensitivity or emotional discomfort, but it happened often enough that it became an unspoken rule: be swift, be silent, and never pull too hard. As you take one last glance into that intimate moment, you notice how the firelight dances along her damp strands, framed in soft ringlets, soon to be hidden again beneath a bonnet. The ritual is complete. Another month will pass before it's repeated. Now, follow the creaking wheels of a laundry cart as it disappears down a narrow service corridor, laden with lace flannel and more than a few secrets. For all her modesty, Queen Victoria was no minimalist. Her daily wardrobe included multiple layers, chemises, corsets, petticoats, stockings, gowns, gloves, and each required laundering. Multiply that by 7 days a week, and then consider the needs of an entire court. The result: a never-ending cascade of soiled linens, sweat-stiffened bodices, and royal undergarments in dire need of attention. The palace laundry was no mere side room. It was a complex system humming beneath the glittering halls above. You find yourself now in one of its many chambers, warm with steam and tinged with lye. Servants move with practiced efficiency, scrubbing fabric against wooden boards, hanging crinolines near open windows, and boiling entire sheets in vats large enough to stew an ox. What's astonishing is how much of the Queen's clothing was reused, repurposed, or mended rather than discarded. Despite her wealth, Victoria kept garments for years, sometimes decades. Corsets were relined, chemises patched. Attendants often embroidered tiny color-coded marks inside garments to track their age and purpose. There's even a recorded case of a royal underskirt being altered and reused as late as Victoria's 70th year. And the laundry itself, brutal. Victorian cleaning products included harsh soaps, ammonia, and bleaching powders that wore down fabric quickly. Yet delicacy was essential. Royal lace could not simply be scrubbed. It was gently basted onto muslin and submerged piece by piece in special baths. Drying took place indoors, never in open air to avoid dust smoke or the ever-present smell of horse manure drifting in from city streets. Some scholars continue to debate the scale of laundry operations within the palace. Was it all handled on site, or were some items discreetly sent to outside laundresses? Records are incomplete, and the truth may lie somewhere in between. But one thing is certain. Those who worked the palace laundries labored in heat haste and near invisibility. The laundry crisis wasn't just about volume, it was about timing. The Queen changed outfits up to 5 times a day depending on events. Morning dress riding, habit, tea gown, dinner, ensemble, evening wear. All with matching linens and layers. If an item wasn't ready on time, a chain reaction of embarrassment could ripple through the staff. One delay, and suddenly a lady in waiting was pinning lace in a corridor, while the Queen tapped her fingers in displeasure. There's an overlooked intimacy in thinking about laundry this way, not as background noise, but as an essential function of royalty. These garments soaked up her sweat, bore the scent of her perfumes, and wrapped her in ritual each morning and night. You imagine the bustle below stairs as another bundle is sorted. The Queen's stockings here, a half-washed corset there, and one mysterious handkerchief bearing the faintest trace of ink and rose water. Even in silence, the laundry tells stories of long days' private discomforts and the unglamorous engine that kept the monarchy clothed and composed. A breath of roses, then jasmine. Then something muskier, headier, almost overwhelming. In the royal boudoir, perfume lingered longer than soap ever could. For Queen Victoria's scent was more than vanity. It was strategy. The perfumes she favored were rich, layered, and powerful enough to hold their own against the less delightful aromas of palace life. After all, when bathing was infrequent and corsets trapped perspiration close to the skin, scent became a substitute for soap, and sometimes a more effective one. You drift now through her dressing chamber, where glass bottles line a carved oak vanity. Each is etched with gilt lettering and stoppered tightly to preserve the precious oils inside. Victorian perfumes weren't the gentle spritzes of modern cologne. They were concentrates, potent mixtures of floral extracts, animal musks, and alcohol bases applied with dabbing rods or glove fingertips. Victoria's personal favorite white rose. It was said to be elegant, delicate, and not too sweet. She also had a fondness for orange blossom and heliotrope, though on formal occasions she opted for heavier blends infused with civet or ambergris. These exotic fixatives harvested from animals were prized for their staying power. One drop could last for days, perfect for royal audiences or long carriage rides. But there's a paradox here. Despite using scent to mask the body's natural musk, Victoria reportedly disliked perfumes that were too obvious. She wanted her presence to be subtly scented, never overwhelming. A contradiction, certainly, but one that reveals the delicate balance of royal decorum and personal preference. Some scholars continue to puzzle over the sheer volume of perfumes recorded in her household accounts. Did she use them all? Were they gifts, or were some simply symbols of status meant to impress rather than delight? The records offer no clear answer. One curious practice involved scenting handkerchiefs. These were spritzed lightly and carried with her or left on pillows. The queen also requested that correspondence from family and favored courtiers be lightly perfumed, especially letters from Prince Albert during their courtship. The scent, she said, made the words feel closer to the heart. And her servants. Well, their olfactory experience was mixed. While perfumes helped soften the less pleasant smells of infrequent bathing and heavy garments, they also mingled in strange ways with sweat dust and kitchen smoke. Some attendants wore nose pegs, as you'll see soon, but others simply adjusted breathing through their mouths or focusing on the floral notes. There is no scholarly consensus on whether perfume was a matter of personal comfort for Victoria or simply a practical necessity. But its presence in nearly every room she occupied speaks volumes. When she couldn't cleanse the body, she cloaked it in scent. You stand now beside her vanity, the room quiet but fragrant. The candlelight catches the cut glass of a violet bottle, casting floral shadows on the wallpaper. Somewhere in the palace, roses bloom, artificial ones, bottled ones reminding everyone that cleanliness, at least here, comes in layers. It begins with a gasp, a sharp tug, and the sound of laces pulled tight corset time. Queen Victoria's hygiene struggles weren't limited to rare bathing or perfume concealment. A large part of the problem was structural, literally. The corsets she wore daily didn't just shape her silhouette. They trapped sweat-limited airflow and compressed internal organs in ways that would make a modern physiotherapist faint. Step now into her dressing room once more. You're standing behind the queen as two maids work in unison. One holds the stays taut, while the other threads the back like a shoelace. A small stool rests nearby for the queen to grip as she breathes in and lifts her arms, preparing for the squeeze. Corsetry was the backbone of Victorian fashion, especially among the upper class. But it came at a cost. Doctors of the era warned against tight-lacing a practice that narrowed the waist to dramatic proportions. Victoria didn't go to such extremes, at least not compared to fashionable debutantes, but even her moderate corsets restricted movement and perspiration. Made of whalebone canvas and cotton, they were rarely washed, often damp from wear, and absorbed both perfume and perspiration, like historical sponges. There is no scholarly consensus on how many corsets Victoria owned, but some records suggest she rotated between day and evening versions, with special ones designed for morning pregnancy and travel. One rare example preserved in a museum shows careful reinforcement around the midsection, perhaps customized for her changing body over decades of rule. Quirky details abound. One corset included a hidden pocket for a handkerchief. Another had silk embroidery, though no one but attendants would ever see it. These details weren't for display, they were for comfort, familiarity, and perhaps a touch of vanity even in private. Some scholars argue that these garments contributed significantly to her persistent health complaints, indigestion, fatigue, and shortness of breath. Others believe the queen simply accepted them as normal. Every woman of her class wore them after all. Still anecdotal letters from ladies-in-waiting describe moments when Victoria, alone in her chambers, would loosen her stays slightly and sigh with relief. There was also the laundry issue. Corsets weren't washed frequently, if at all. Instead, liners were added, then removed and laundered separately. Linen chemises absorbed most of the body's moisture, sparing the corset, but not eliminating the odor. By week's end, the layered effect of scent, sweat, and soap residue was formidable. Yet Victoria viewed the corset not as a burden, but as armor. It was part of her royal identity, a symbol of uprightness and control. To remove it would have felt like letting the empire slouch. So, here you are, watching the final tug of a ribbon. The click of metal clasps the rustle of skirts falling into place. She straightens, breathes shallowly, and nods once. The queen is dressed. She is presentable. She is sealed. And beneath all that dignity under the silks and sashes is a damp cotton lining that hasn't seen daylight in 3 weeks. You pass a velvet-draped hallway and come face to face with the queen, her portrait. Immaculate, serene aglow, with powdered skin and regal composure. But behind that oil-painted elegance, something more pungent. There's a stark contrast between Victoria's pristine public image and the less polished private reality that swirled behind palace walls. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of decorum and discipline, hair-coiffed, lace-pristine expression, composed. But letters from family members, staff, and even foreign dignitaries hint at a quieter truth the queen, like anyone, occasionally smelled human. The contradiction is fascinating. You lean in closer to that painted likeness crafted to last centuries and wonder how many layers of rose oil lavender sachets and tightly corseted sweat went into making the illusion stick. According to royal correspondence, the public rarely glimpsed the more aromatic side of the monarchy. But in private, even Victoria's own children remarked on their mother's aversion to frequent bathing and the closed-up air of her rooms. One lady-in-waiting described the Queen's quarters as over-warm, over-scented, and over-quiet, a euphemism perhaps for a staleness that could not be perfumed away. Still no outsider ever dared mention it aloud. The royal presence was too formidable, too rehearsed. Even when guests entered her presence for hours, they likely left wondering how someone could be so regal and yet so unventilated. Some historians suggest that photography helped reinforce the Queen's immaculate image. Unlike real-life photos, did not carry scent. They showed her composed in heavy velvet and jet beads, surrounded by stillness and shadows. The lens could never capture the warmth of an unwashed neck, or the linen layers that trapped the body's musk. It was visual deodorant, so to speak, history's first real airbrush. But written records paint a different picture. Some courtiers hinted at an odor of the old rooms after long illness or travel. Even Victoria herself, in a rare moment of candor, once described her own gloves as slightly close after a summer outing, Victorian shorthand for sweaty. There is no scholarly consensus on how often these private smells disrupted court life, but there's agreement that they were acknowledged only in whispers. Maids opened windows in passing. Attendants placed extra sachets under pillows or among linens. And still, the scent lingered, a reminder that monarchy, however gilded, was still human. Quirky details continue to emerge. One chambermaid noted that the Queen's dogs, particularly her spaniels, were often allowed to curl up in her skirts, adding their own contribution to the olfactory mix. Another recalled that Victoria insisted her favorite rooms be sprayed with a particular rose water, which by the end of summer mixed oddly with mildew and wool. So, you stand now before that regal likeness, flawless, still, and silent, and understand just how much effort went into maintaining the illusion. Behind the glamour was a complex bouquet lavender musk, starch, and thyme. The canvas remains odorless. The real queen did not. Step softly now, for you are entering a chamber ruled not by sight or sound, but by scent. And no one sniffed out a scandal quite like Queen Victoria. Her nose, according to dozens of eyewitness accounts, was legendary. Sensitive to perfumes, sweat smoke, mildew, and even polished brass. The Queen's olfactory power became a silent force in court life. A bouquet too strong, a guest too pungent. Even the faintest whiff of something off could sour her mood for days. You're standing now at the edge of a drawing room, as footmen adjust curtains and maids discreetly swap flower arrangements, all to please a nose that they feared could detect whether carnations or lilies had been delivered first. Some claimed Victoria could smell damp wood after a single rainfall. Others insisted she once asked a visiting ambassador to remove his gloves not for etiquette, but because she couldn't abide their scent. Historians continue to debate whether her olfactory sensitivity was physical or psychological. Some suggest it was heightened by migraines or neuralgia, both ailments the Queen reported throughout her life. Others believe it reflected her desire for control in a court where appearances and aromas mattered more than spoken words. But her nose didn't only affect floral choices, it shaped protocol. Before any official event, courtiers and staff underwent what was jokingly called the sniff test. Hands were checked for remnants of tobacco breath, for coffee or onions. Gloves had to be newly laundered, and colognes were restricted to approved scents. One poor diplomat reportedly wore bay rum and was never invited back. Victoria's own favorites curiously were restrained orange blossom rose violet. Anything overly musky or spicy was banned from her presence. Yet she could tolerate the smells of horses and dogs, perhaps because she associated them with loyalty and comfort rather than artifice. In one revealing episode, a servant's dinner of herring caused such offense that the Queen issued a formal notice banning strong-smelling fish from being cooked within 100 feet of her private chambers. No exceptions. The irony. Despite this hypersensitivity, Victoria often failed to recognize how her own layers of unwashed linen and rarely aired rooms might affect others. That contradiction, keenly aware of scent, yet curiously unaware of her own, became a quiet tension within the palace. Servants whispered attendants traded remedies, but no one dared tell the Queen that her cherished room sprays couldn't always mask the musk of 3-week-old corsetry. Some accounts hint that Prince Albert, her beloved husband, played mediator. He reportedly kept the air moving during visits, opened windows before she arrived, and gently redirected complaints. But after his death, few had the nerve or nose for it. And so, you find yourself now in a chamber filled with dried lavender rosewater mist and the faintest trace of damp wool. A realm where everything is judged not by sight, but by smell. And if it pleased the Queen's nose, it stayed. If not, it vanished like yesterday's bouquet. Hold your breath, not out of fear, but in solidarity. In the lower halls of Buckingham Palace, where the floors creak and the wallpaper peels ever so slightly, you might catch sight of a curious accessory among the staff nose pegs. Little wads of cloth or wax tucked gently into the nostrils, sometimes soaked in vinegar, rose oil, or camphor. Not exactly standard issue, but quietly essential. Queen Victoria's hygiene, or lack thereof, was one matter. But for the people tasked with assisting her, maids, footmen, dressers, the olfactory toll could be overwhelming. Corsets, reworn linens, perfumed but never fully washed, and chamber pots emptied discreetly but persistently. A nose unarmed was a nose in peril. As you walk now beside a young chambermaid carrying a bundle of day dresses, notice the way she lifts her chin slightly, not in pride, but to keep her nostrils angled away from the bodice. A cloth-wrapped peg rests just inside one nostril, barely visible. She is practiced polite and determined not to offend her employer or her own senses. The use of nose pegs wasn't documented in official staff manuals. It existed in a gray area between necessity and taboo. Maids whispered about it in servants' quarters, passing down recipes for scent-soaking solutions. Camphor for nausea, lavender for sleep, clove oil when all else failed. Some staff preferred dabbing perfume directly under the nose with a scrap of lace, while others tied handkerchiefs around their faces under the guise of dusting. There is little scholarly consensus on how widespread the practice was, though scattered diary entries and letters from staff make frequent mention of defenses or insulations. One footman joked in a letter home that he kept an extra cloth for the Queen and one for myself. Another described a colleague fainting during a particularly humid summer afternoon, when the Queen had refused to open her windows and the scent in the sitting room became dense as pudding. Servants had to remain invisible, silent, and unbothered, To react visibly, wrinkle a nose, flinch, or worse was unthinkable. One maid reportedly lost her position after sneezing near the Queen's dressing table, an accident that could have been caused by the heavy perfumes or simply the dust trapped in layered textiles. Yet, even with such strict expectations, the staff found ways to cope. Humor was one tool. In the servants' hall, they gave nicknames to rooms based on scent: the lavender den, the musk tomb, the patchouli prison. They speculated on which royal dog contributed most to the olfactory blend. And during holidays, it became tradition for senior staff to gift new maids with handmade sachets, part joke, part lifeline. You now find yourself just outside the Queen's private study. The door is closed, but the air carries a hint of rose starch and something earthier. A footman adjusts his gloves, subtly reaches into his pocket, and presses a scented kerchief beneath his nose. He exhales carefully. Because in the palace, silence was golden, but scent could be unforgiving. The knock is gentle, the door creaks open, and a man steps in. Top hat removed hands, scrubbed raw eyes politely averted. The royal physician has arrived. In an age when bathing was rare, modesty was absolute, and medical tools looked more like fireplace tongs than instruments of healing. Examining Queen Victoria was no easy feat. Victorian medicine, even among the elite, was constrained by etiquette superstition and a stubborn refusal to expose what was deemed unexposable. You find yourself now in her sitting room, where the air is warm with candlelight and the soft rustle of skirts. The Queen sits upright, corset tightened her expression, unreadable. The physician Bose says little and knows not to ask direct questions, especially not about bodily functions. Such topics were danced around with euphemisms: unease, fluttering, discomfort, or simply the nerves. Some historians argue that Queen Victoria's dislike of bathing was reinforced by her medical advisors, many of whom cautioned against overwashing. Doctors warned that water could excite the humors or provoke fainting spells in delicate women. One even claimed that wet hair could cause melancholy. Victoria, already cautious by nature, followed such advice dutifully and passed it down as custom. There was also the matter of access. A doctor could not examine the Queen directly unless granted express permission. Even then, a female attendant was often present, and layers of clothing were rarely removed. Victoria might present a wrist, a tongue, or describe a symptom through her maid. Diagnoses, unsurprisingly, were often vague. What's curious is how the Queen herself viewed cleanliness. She equated it more with order than with sanitation. If her room was tidy, her linens pressed, her perfumes arranged just so, then she was clean regardless of when she last bathed. Her physicians, eager to maintain royal favor, rarely challenged this logic. One notable exception occurred during a feverish spell in 1859, when a young court physician, perhaps a bit too confident, suggested a lukewarm bath to ease her discomfort. The Queen reportedly looked horrified and declined on the spot, opting instead for cool cloths and stronger tinctures. Still, medicine at the time wasn't entirely without advances. Antiseptics were beginning to gain traction. Germ theory had entered the conversation, though not yet the textbooks. Some scholars debate whether Victoria ever truly understood the connection between hygiene and illness. She endorsed hospitals and championed cleanliness in her army barracks, but seemed content to let her personal habits remain firmly in the past. And then there's the peculiar detail of her doctor's bag, a leather satchel filled not with syringes or stethoscopes, but with tinctures, tonics, smelling salts, and a small tin of violet pastilles. Soothing rather than curing, fragrant rather than sterile. Now the visit ends. The Queen nods, the physician bows again, and the room exhales. No questions were asked that couldn't be answered with silence, and no remedy was prescribed that might disturb the Queen's peace or her layers. You step into the hallway as the doctor departs past servants who straighten with practiced ease. They don't ask what he found. They already know nothing the Queen wished to discuss. The royal boots were polished to a mirror sheen. The sun had dared to shine. And so, Queen Victoria decided to go for a walk straight into a sewage disaster. It was the summer of 1858 during what Londoners grimly dubbed the Great Stink. The Thames, once a proud artery of empire, had become a slow-moving soup of human waste, industrial runoff, and decomposing refuse. You would think the monarch might avoid it altogether, but Victoria, determined to maintain appearances and take in her capital, stepped into a carriage and ventured toward the river. What happened next became the stuff of whispered legend among palace staff. She alighted near Westminster for a brief stroll. The breeze was uncooperative, blowing the foul stench straight into the royal party. But Victoria pressed on, aided by a parasol and polite denial. Then, somewhere between a cobbled curb and an unlucky drainage grate, she placed one dainty foot squarely into a slick of street runoff, sewage rainwater, and perhaps something worse. Her shoe, a delicate creation of leather and embroidered silk, was never seen again. Servants acted instantly. A footman offered his handkerchief. A lady-in-waiting tried to joke about London weather, but the Queen was not amused. She returned to the palace in silence, reportedly discarding the entire walking ensemble. That afternoon, an edict was issued: walks near the river would henceforth be conducted at a respectable distance. There is no scholarly consensus on whether this particular incident inspired action, but just weeks later, Parliament finally funded the construction of Joseph Bazalgette's new sewer system, a marvel of civil engineering that transformed London sanitation. Victoria herself later praised the improvements, though she never again ventured that close to the riverbank on foot. This incident reveals more than just a soiled boot. It highlights the tension between royal image and urban reality. Victoria wished to be seen as a modern monarch engaged with her city. Yet she was walking through a capital where even the highest born could not escape the stench of progress delayed. You now find yourself on that same cobblestone path, the air hot and thick with a sour tang. The Thames glistens beside you, deceptively serene, but beneath its surface swirls a city's secrets. A carriage passes. In its window, a flash of dark eyes and a stiff posture. You might imagine the Queen herself, still offended, still sniffing the memory from her gloves. Even palace records couldn't sanitize this particular moment. One diary notes only that Her Majesty's return was premature due to unfavorable conditions. But among staff, it became a cautionary tale: never underestimate the unpredictability of city streets or of nature's persistence. Some quirky accounts even claim that the shoe was later recovered, cleaned, and preserved. Others say it was burned immediately along with the carpet it touched upon her return. No one agrees, but the image lingers: a monarch mid-stride, caught by the very forces her empire was trying to control. And all it took was one unfortunate puddle. You're standing on a Scottish hillside now, the air sharp with heather and distant wood smoke. Balmoral Castle rises behind you, less formal than Buckingham, more rugged but still unmistakably royal. Queen Victoria adored this place. Yet even here, surrounded by wild beauty and fresh air, her hygiene habits remained predictably restrained. Holidays were meant to be restorative, and Victoria took them seriously. Each summer, she retreated to Balmoral with a smaller entourage, fewer engagements, and a slower pace. But don't mistake that for wilderness adventure. Despite the rustic charm, her habits came with her sponge baths instead of soaks, perfumed linens instead of clean ones, and portable commodes disguised as trunks or footstools. Here in the Highlands, she fancied herself simpler, more grounded. She wore tartan shawls, walked with a cane, and even helped with tea service. But her personal routines remained rigid. Her traveling bath was rarely used. Most days began with a warm cloth to the face, a quick brush of the hair, and the application of just enough scent to outpace the dogs. Her staff, meanwhile, adapted to the surroundings. There were no grand laundries here. Clothes had to be cleaned by hand in stream-fed basins often dried on racks near smoky fireplaces. Water had to be carried in buckets from distant wells. A maid once wrote home describing the strange challenge of boiling bath water over peat fires and hauling it through corridors. With fingers crossed, the Queen doesn't change her mind by the time it arrives. The Queen loved outdoor excursions, especially long rides through the hills in an open carriage. But she rarely broke a sweat. Her pace was deliberate, her clothing layered but loose, and her attendants always close by, with parasols, refreshments, and occasionally discreet dabs of floral water to keep appearances in check. Some scholars remain curious about the hygiene standards in these retreats. Did Victoria relax them further while away from court, or did the lack of infrastructure prompt even more rigid routines to compensate? The records offer conflicting clues. Letters from her ladies suggest she sometimes skipped even her usual sponge bath, relying instead on cologne and a vigorous brushing of the skin believed at the time to stimulate circulation and cleanse the pores. A particularly quirky story from Balmoral tells of the Queen refusing to enter a particular guest room because the air smelled stale with previous use. She insisted on airing it for 3 full days before stepping inside, while continuing to sleep in her usual room, where her spaniel shared the foot of her bed, and her linens hadn't been changed in a week. Still, Victoria's holidays offered something rare peace. The court's relentless formality gave way to a slower rhythm, one where even the Queen's more peculiar habits could settle quietly into the landscape. You watch now as her carriage disappears down a wooded trail, the scent of rosewater fading into pine. The air is brisk the hills roll on, and even the Queen's carefully cloaked rituals seem softer somehow in the wind. Even empires must bathe eventually. As Queen Victoria's life drew to a close in 1901, so too did an era defined by starch steam and stubbornly selective hygiene. But her legacy didn't just linger in statues or postage stamps. It clung to the very standards of cleanliness in the British monarchy. Her peculiar relationship with soap scent and modesty shaped royal norms long after the final curtain fell. You're now back at Osborne House, her favorite retreat on the Isle of Wight, where the halls are hushed and the windows overlook quiet gardens. The Queen's final years were marked by routine rituals of grooming, pared down to the bare minimum. Her sponge baths became shorter, her perfumes stronger, her corsets looser but never abandoned. Attendants noted that in her last months, Victoria rejected even the suggestion of a full bath. Too taxing, she reportedly muttered. Instead, she allowed only the gentlest cloths warmed by the fire to be used by her most trusted maids. Linens were refreshed more often, but still only as needed. If a sheet did not smell off, it was folded again for use the next night. Some scholars believe these habits were born from practicality. Age made movement difficult, and the idea of stepping into a copper tub seemed more hazard than luxury. Others argue it was about consistency, about keeping the world familiar, manageable and scented just the way she liked it. But there is no scholarly consensus on how aware Victoria was of how her standards affected those around her. Her daughters, granddaughters, and successors inherited not only her throne, but her quiet discomfort with exposure and her complex views on bodily care. For decades, royal etiquette retained that same squeamishness. Baths were private perfumes, strong servants silent. And yet, times changed. Edward VII brought more modern plumbing to court. His successor, George V, was known to take regular morning baths. Elizabeth II, Victoria's great-great-granddaughter, would later be the first monarch raised with truly modern hygiene expectations. showers toothpaste hot water on demand. Still echoes of Victoria's influence remained in the emphasis on discretion control and the careful management of one's image. Perhaps the quirkiest legacy of all lies in a single royal regulation issued not long after her death: the official inclusion of a second bathroom per royal suite, one for bathing, one for attendance. A quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, that even queens must adapt eventually. You find yourself now standing in her former chamber, where the light filters through lace curtains, and the air carries only the faintest trace of lavender and old wood. The furniture is still arranged just so. A water jug rests beside a folded towel, and beside the bed, the last chamber pot unused but never removed. It's peaceful here, no longer bustling with servants or perfume, but still unmistakably hers. A place where dignity was maintained not by scrubbing, but by habit, where royalty meant routine, and where the smallest rituals, however fragrant or forgotten, once held the empire in place. But while queens held court in scented chambers, someone always had to clean the basins. And downstairs, far from lace and lavender, another world was already scrubbing its way to order. You crouch low as the floor groans above. Somewhere upstairs, the first footman stirs, but down here in the scullery, it's just you and the water. The basin waits a dented, grimy tub fitted into the brickwork, permanently damp, and smelling faintly of iron and old cabbage. Beside it, the kindling crackles under the stove, reluctant to do its duty. Your breath fogs the air as you plunge your hands in. Welcome to the first wash of the day. There's a rhythm to the misery: sleeves, rolled elbows, deep knuckles cracking against the rough ceramic. The water's not warm, not yet. It won't be for hours. For now, you scrub by instinct, dipping stained cloth into chilled suds that quickly turn a murky gray. Bits of last night's dinner float up peas bones, the occasional surprise. You're not just washing dishes. You're resetting history, erasing the excesses of another dinner you didn't eat. Overhead, pipes groan. A rat scurries past your boot with practiced ease, unimpressed by your toil. The brick floor is slick always, and your apron is damp within minutes. But you keep going, because this is just the beginning. It was often children, or the lowest-ranked housemaids assigned to scullery duty jobs no one wanted but everyone relied on. It's said that a good scullery maid could clean an entire room without lifting her eyes from the ground. Efficiency was survival. One servant's memoir recalled scalding her forearms so often she no longer felt heat or cold, just dampness and duty. Still, some scholars debate just how grim the scullery truly was. Did every home run like Downton Abbey's boiler room? Likely not. Surviving records vary wildly between households. But one thing is certain: this basin, this moment, was the starting line for every upward ripple of cleanliness. You pause just briefly as the water finally warms under your fingers. A puff of steam rises, less like comfort, more like surrender. And just like that, the morning begins. By now your sleeves are damp, your cheeks flush from the scullery's chill. But the next task waits hauling water. And not just a bucket or two. We're talking gallons. You grab the first iron pail by its curved handle, cold as the queen's stare, and brace your back. The servant's entrance looms like a dungeon gate. Beyond it, the pump yard. The air outside is sharp with frost. You crunch across gravel that's slick underfoot ice, clinging to every puddle. The pump stands crooked in the yard, stubborn and stiff. You work the lever slow and steady as the first glugs echo down the pipe. A gush of freezing water shoots into the pail, splashing your apron. Welcome to your full-body wake-up call. The buckets grow heavy fast. You're not just lifting water, you're lifting entire expectations. Upstairs, hot baths and boiled eggs await. But first, You carry the bones of those comforts sloshing precariously up crooked stone steps, arms straining against metal and liquid weight. Now, imagine doing this in corsets, a full-bodied stay pinching your ribs, hems dragging in mud, laced so tightly your spine complains before your arms do. Servant uniforms were no athletic gear. They were stiff layered and always soaked at the hem. The phrase "no pain, no gain" never smelled so much like wet wool. It's estimated that a full day's water hauling for a medium-sized Victorian household could require over 100 gallons for washing, cooking, bathing, and laundry. That's roughly 800 pounds of liquid manually lifted, poured, and hauled by one or two people. Historians generally agree it was the most physically demanding part of a domestic servant's job. Still, diaries from the time rarely dwell on the drudgery. One wonders, were they just too tired to write? Some scholars suggest the silence around water carrying in upper-class journals was intentional. Keeping the dirt and the labor out of sight preserved the illusion of effortless elegance. But scullery maids knew the truth that luxury rode in on their bruised shoulders. As you make another trip up the narrow stair, the handles bite into your palms. You pause breathless, watching a droplet snake down the side of the pail and fall onto your boot. The rhythm becomes mindless. Pump, lift, walk, spill, return. Each trip earns you a new ache. Inside the copper tub waits to be filled. Upstairs, bells will soon ring, summoning tea trays, fresh towels, warm water. But you're already moving, because stopping. That's not part of the job. A crow caws somewhere in the gray sky, mocking you with its freedom. The sun rises slowly, brushing frost from the rooftops. Your breath puffs out like smoke as you lift the next bucket muscles, shaking just a little more than before. And yet, you keep going. Because in a Victorian household, everything clean started with everything cold. The cold may numb your fingers, but what's worse is knowing it's still not enough. The tub isn't full, not by a long shot. You look into the copper basin, its gleam dulled by soot and soap scum, and see only a few inches of water sloshing at the bottom. Now comes the truly Herculean task, boiling enough water to make it suitable for a bath. You shuffle back to the hearth, where the range fire sputters reluctantly. Coal is precious and kindling is damp. The copper kettle, larger than some newborns, sits stubbornly over the fire, slowly warming with all the urgency of a napping tortoise. You bend down to stoke the embers, fanning the flames with a battered tin plate. Smoke stings your eyes, and a stray ash lands on your cheek like a cruel kiss. Boiling bath water wasn't a luxury. It was a feat. Heating even a single bucket to bathing temperature could take an hour. For an entire tub, it might take 3. Servants kept kettles rotating in shifts, cycling from range to tub and back again, like clockwork with cracked hands. If your master wanted a bath before breakfast, you were up before the birds. In larger homes, some families employed boilermen, yes, an entire position just for hot water. But in most middle-class households, the task fell to whomever drew the shortest straw. It was often the undermaid half your size whose arms shook from hauling cauldrons you could barely lift. And the worst part, the bath wasn't even for you. Historians still dispute how common full-tub bathing really was. Some argue that many Victorians preferred a good sponge down, given the labor and fuel costs of a bath. But surviving laundry logs and housekeeper accounts suggest that for the wealthy, a warm soak was both indulgence and status symbol, regardless of the servant's suffering. As you struggle to pour one kettle into the tub without scalding yourself, your boots slip on the damp stone. You steady the kettle just in time, your wrists screaming from the weight. A small victory. But 5 more kettles await. A whistle shrieks from the kettle behind you. Time to swap again. You wipe your brow with a soot-blackened sleeve blinking through the haze. The smell of smoke and singed linen clings to everything. At least the heat has reached your knuckles now, not warm, but no longer bone stiff. You glance at the tub, still shallow, still lukewarm. The sound of footsteps overhead warns you the lady of the house is stirring. Your pace quickens. Another kettle, another trip. The tub steams faintly now, like a ghost exhaling. You've nearly filled it, but the water's already cooling. There's no victory here, only momentum. Boiling water is a race against time and thermodynamics, and the house always wins. The final kettle sloshes in with a hiss. You pause dizzy from heat and smoke and allow yourself a single breath of satisfaction. Then you remember someone has to scrub the tub next. The tub may be full now, but the work has only just begun. Because in a Victorian household, even the water had standards, and so did the bathtub. And while the lady of the house may lower herself gracefully into scented warmth, someone else must first confront the unsavory truth: tubs are filthy. You kneel beside the basin sponge in hand. The soap scum from the last bath has clung to the copper like a stubborn memory. Hair-skin flakes and a faint ring of gray cling just above the waterline, a shadow of someone else's leisure. You dip the sponge squeeze scrub, then again, and again. Each motion is automatic, practiced exhausting. Scrubbing the royal tub, or any nobles for that matter, was a delicate task. You were expected to be thorough, invisible, and above all, silent. No clattering, no humming, no complaints. The bath was a sanctuary. You were the ghost that haunted it there, to clean, not to be seen. The average Victorian tub was freestanding, heavy, and difficult to drain. Some were lined in copper or tin, others cast in porcelain so porous they absorbed soap scents for days. The bath had to be cleaned before each use, after each use, and sometimes even mid-soak if the bather was particularly fussy. You scrub, rinse, and polish in rhythmic misery, using cloths that smell faintly of vinegar and wear. One diary from a manor house in Surrey mentions a maid assigned solely to the tub on Tuesdays. Not the bather, just the tub. It had its own schedule like a demanding pet. Some households required perfume rinses to follow the soap, or insisted on drying the surface with warmed cloths, so no chill would offend the noble posterior. There's debate among scholars about the chemical concoctions used during this period. Some records mention lemon juice and ashes, others favor soft soaps and lye. The exact formula depended on rank budget and how prone your employer was to rashes. Yet nearly all sources agree. Scrubbing wasn't just about hygiene, it was about appearance. As you polish the rim with your final cloth, you spot a dent in the tub's edge barely noticeable unless you're kneeling this close. You wonder how it got there. Did some long-forgotten servant drop a kettle too hard? Did a gentleman slip during an overly enthusiastic soak? No one speaks of such things. But the tub remembers. And then there's the awkward ritual of cleaning during a bath. Should the bather notice a smudge or a hair, you'd be summoned mid-soak, forced to rewash a section with lowered eyes and murmured apologies. One servant wrote of scrubbing a tub as a duke floated idly within, humming a song she couldn't name. A ridiculous scene, yes. But in Victorian service, decorum trumped dignity. The water sloshes gently now, steam curling upwards like silk. The tub gleams, your back aches. And somewhere upstairs, someone stretches luxuriously, preparing to undo in minutes what took you an hour to perfect. With the tub finally gleaming and the last kettle emptied, you'd think the ordeal was over. But no, now comes the soap, or rather, the problem of soap. Because in a Victorian household, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of hot water and hard scrubbing. It depended on slippery little bars that mysteriously vanished, reappeared, or crumbled into nothing at the worst possible moment. You reach into the linen cupboard for a fresh bar, only to find a crusty sliver tucked between folded towels. Typical. Good soap, especially scented or imported, was kept under lock and key, often by the housekeeper herself. What you have instead is household soap, a dense yellow-gray lump that smells vaguely of animal fat and cellar walls. Soap was made from a base of rendered fat, and lie a process best left to alchemists, and those with no sense of smell. In poorer homes, it was made on-site bubbling in outdoor kettles that hissed and frothed like witches' brews. In grander estates, it arrived in wax-papered blocks stamped with names like Piers or Carbolic, and treated like currency. A single bar might last weeks or disappear in a day if someone was careless. Servants accused each other regularly. The soap thief was a running joke in many houses, but sometimes the accusation was deadly serious. One undermaid was fired according to a footnote in a steward's ledger for unaccounted usage of tallow-based lavenders. Translation, she dropped the good soap and couldn't explain why. Researchers still debate how widely soap was actually used among working-class Victorians. Some argue that washing was more often done with plain water and friction, especially when money was tight. Others point to advertisements and journals that show a rising obsession with soap's moral power. Cleanliness, they insisted, meant virtue. And yet, here you are, virtue in hand, scrubbing the underside of a copper basin with a half-melted nub. The smell sticks to your fingers for hours, a mix of lye salt and regret. Soap storage was another battlefield. It couldn't be too dry or it cracked, too moist and it turned to slime. Some housekeepers stored it in linen-lined drawers, others wrapped it in paper, and rotated the bars weekly like fine cheese. There were even reports of scented soaps being used as drawer sachets, not to be touched, just to make the linen smell respectable. You recall once finding a bar stamped with a royal crest, unused, forgotten, in the corner of a cabinet. It crumbled at your touch, years of dignity turned to dust. Now you rinse your hands in the basin, watching the soap traces swirl into gray water. One bar gone. A dozen tasks still to go. The mystery of soap, its making, guarding, and vanishing, feels absurdly grand for such a humble thing. But that's Victorian life, in a nutshell. Small objects, big drama. You dry your hands on a stiff cloth. Somewhere the next wash awaits bare hands again, hoping there's just enough soap left to make it matter. If soap was scarce, starch was sacred, and no room worshipped it more devoutly than the laundry. You enter the wash house and are instantly greeted by a wave of steam that clings to your skin and curls your hair. It's hot, oppressively so, and the air tastes like boiled linen and burnt starch. Welcome to the belly of the beast, a chamber of suds, smoke, and sweat. In one corner, two women bend over zinc tubs, sleeves rolled and cheeks flushed. Their hands move like metronomes dip scrub ring. A third wrangles a mangle cranking soaked sheets between rollers until they groan and drip no more. And in the center, the starch table, a smooth wooden slab dusted with powder, flanked by irons so heavy they require both hands and considerable faith to lift. Starch was the secret to status. Crisp collars, stiff cuffs, and petticoats that rustled like paper. These were the marks of a household properly managed. But making starch wasn't for the faint of heart. It started with boiling wheat rice or even potatoes until they reduced into a sticky paste. This mixture was strained, cooled, then massaged into fabric with painstaking care. Too little and the garment sagged. Too much and it cracked like porcelain. Victorian servants didn't just wash clothes, they sculpted them. One underlaundress wrote of ironing for 7 straight hours on Mondays, collapsing in the coal yard afterward with burns on both wrists. There were no shortcuts, no wrinkled forgiveness. If a master's shirt puckered, you'd hear about it. If a lady's lace was too limp, you'd feel it in reputation, in pay, or in dismissal. Scholars continue to debate whether laundry was the most brutal of all servant assignments. Some say it was the kitchen, with its constant burns and boils. Others insist The laundry took the crown with its endless lifting steam inhalation and blisters that bled through bandages. But most agree on this: laundry maids didn't just endure, they vanished behind their labor. You move toward the pressing table, reaching for the flat iron that's been heating on the stove. It sizzles slightly as you test it with a flick of water. Ready. You wrap a scorched cloth around the handle and begin smoothing a handkerchief embroidered with the tiniest of initials. If the monogram curls, it's your fault. If it doesn't sparkle, also your fault. You press with all the steadiness you can muster. The heat seeps through the cloth and into your bones. Another piece finished set aside with reverence. Then another, and another. A rhythm builds, the hiss of steam, the clack of the mangle, the slap of wet linen against wood. The room blurs in heat and humidity. Your apron sticks to your back. Your shoes squelch slightly when you shift your stance. But you press on literally. Because in this job, pride is measured not in praise, but in precision. One more shirt, one more sleeve. You blink through the haze and keep ironing. The laundry steams behind you now, but your hands remain pruny and raw. And as if boiling undergarments weren't awkward enough, now comes the most delicate duty of all handling the delicates. Lingerie, petticoats, and things, best left unnamed, tumble gently in a basin behind closed doors. These items weren't merely fragile in fabric, they were fragile in reputation. Victorian society thrived on repression. The mere mention of bloomers in mixed company could prompt scandal, or at least a furrowed brow. Yet, someone had to wash them. And more often than not, that someone was you. You draw the laundry screen shut, its faded floral fabric shielding this modest task from prying eyes. Before you lies a wicker basket of lace-trimmed whispers, chemises, corset liners, garters. All modesty above stairs, all perspiration and starch below. You roll your sleeves once more and begin. Lingerie was made from cotton muslin or linen lightweight and prone to fraying. The stitching was fine, the lace imported, and the consequences of damage severe. You couldn't scrub these pieces like socks. You had to coax them clean. A soft soap blend was stirred, tepid water prepared. Then came the soaking, the gentle pressing, the hand squeezing between layers of flannel. No wringing allowed, no twisting, just patient dabbling like laundering secrets. Some houses had rules about who could wash whose underthings. Upper maids handled the ladies, undermaids did the children's, and the master's garments, especially the intimate ones, were whispered about but rarely named. It wasn't uncommon for items to be passed between servants with averted eyes and folded cloths. You didn't talk about who wore what. You just hoped they didn't wear it again too soon. One former maid recalled finding a note pinned discreetly to a corset band. Extra rinse, please. No name, no scolding. Just a gentle request, as if the garment itself had spoken. Another recounted being chastised for folding a chemise too familiarly, whatever that meant. There's little agreement among historians about how servants truly felt about washing such private items. Some say it was embarrassing. Others say it was simply part of the routine, no different than cleaning chamber pots. But many surviving letters hint at awkwardness. Lines like, "Today I handled Lady M's unmentionables again," carry a curious mixture of pride, distaste, and weary resignation. You lay out each washed piece carefully across the drying rack. No sunlight, just a slow breeze and a prayer it dries by morning. Some items are so thin they resemble gauze, almost vanishing against the wooden slats. You handle them like museum artifacts, aware that too much pressure from your fingers could shred them like overboiled cabbage. And still you move through it with silent dignity. Because someone must ensure these garments return upstairs in perfect form, folded fragrant and untouched by embarrassment. Even if you've just spent 20 minutes dabbing at invisible stains while trying not to think about who left them. You wipe your hands on your apron, smirk quietly to yourself, and step out from behind the screen. If you thought washing bloomers was intimate, try shaving a royal chin. Not yours, of course, heaven forbid. You'd be holding the blade, a sharp one, probably near a neck that carries a title, a temper, and a morning whiskey habit. No pressure. The shaving kit gleams before you, a silver basin, a badger hair brush, a tortoiseshell comb, and the razor itself, straight edge, shiny, and indifferent to your nerves. You test the blade on your thumbnail, just as you were taught. It catches perfectly. That's both good news and bad. The gentleman reclines in a leather chair, chin-tilted eyes half closed, with the air of someone expecting perfection before breakfast. You dip the brush into the warm lather, swirl it in a circular motion, and begin to paint his jaw with foam. The room smells faintly of sandalwood and stale cigar smoke. Shaving was not just grooming in the Victorian era. It was ritual performance and diplomacy all in one. Nobles didn't always do it themselves. Instead, they summoned a valet, a barber, or an especially trusted manservant to do the honors. Trust in this case meaning, I believe you won't slit my throat and you know how to angle the blade. There are written accounts from the period describing the terror of this task. One servant claimed he prayed before every shave. Another insisted he learned to breathe only through his nose so as not to accidentally exhale on the nobleman's face. A third simply said, I never looked them in the eye. I just shaved and hoped. Scholars remain divided on how common in-house shaving was versus visits to a local barber. In wealthier homes, the in-house shave was a mark of prestige. The gear alone could cost a small fortune. Ivory-handled razors, imported soaps, and monogrammed towels were the norm. But in smaller homes, it was more likely a Sunday ritual, done weekly quickly, and hopefully without too much blood. You draw the blade slowly down the jawline, wiping it clean on a linen cloth after each stroke. The skin below emerges smooth pink, slightly quivering. Your own hands are steady, though your knees might disagree. Some valets added flourishes, warm towels, draped theatrically, facial massage oils, dabbed with precision, a dash of cologne, spritzed onto a crisp cravat. Others kept it simple, no talking, no scent, no fuss. Just a blade and a prayer. And then there were the close calls, the nicked ear, the startled cough, the sudden sneeze. Each one a career-threatening event if the wrong drop of blood appeared in the wrong basin. One story tells of a prince who sneezed mid-shave, resulting in a scar and an early retirement for the servant, not the prince. As you fold the razor and wipe it dry, you feel a tiny sense of triumph. No blood, no bruised egos, and a jawline so smooth it could cut glass. You place the tools back in their velvet-lined box bows slightly and vanish before breakfast begins. The face may be shaved, but the hair tells a longer story, and sometimes that hair isn't even real. Enter the world of wigs, pomades, powders, and things best left unidentified. Because tending to Victorian wigs was a task both meticulous and mildly horrifying, especially when you knew what might be lurking beneath the curls. You step into the dressing room, where a row of wig stands greet you like a court of silent judges. Each one holds a different persona: the tight powdered curls of a formal dinner wig, the looser auburn ringlets of a socialite's garden stroll, the salt and pepper coif of a retired admiral who still insists on appearing stately at tea. You eye them all warily. There's work to be done. Victorian wigs weren't just fashion, they were armor. They concealed thinning hair age, and more often than not, lice. You lift one carefully examining the undernetting. A few stray hairs flutter loose. You suppress a shudder. The first step is always inspection. The second is hope. Pomades were the lifeblood of Victorian hairstyling, and they were as greasy as they were fragrant. Made from bare fat beef tallow, or sometimes even sweat. These mixtures were scented with lavender rosemary or rose oil to mask their otherwise culinary aroma. Applying pomade meant warming it between your palms until it turned soft, then gently working it through the strands, real or false, until every lock glistened with submission. Then came the brushing. You select a boar bristle brush from the vanity, each tooth finely spaced and designed to glide without snagging. Wig brushing was an art. Too rough and you'd tear fibers. Too gentle and tangles remained. Some maids sang softly as they brushed, not to entertain, but to keep time, ensuring each stroke was deliberate. But even with all the oil brushing and care, wigs aged poorly. They absorbed smoke, sweat, and scandal. A particularly unlucky valet once found a moth colony nesting inside a ceremonial wig worn only twice a year. He was dismissed not for the infestation, but for allowing it to be discovered by the wrong guest. There is little consensus among historians about how often wigs were cleaned. Some say weekly with vinegar and borax. Others claim wigs were rarely washed at all, only powdered and perfumed to mask the rot. Surviving diaries offer few details, perhaps out of embarrassment. But whatever the truth, you're cleaning this one with a damp cloth, a small prayer, and a sense of grim determination. You dab gently at the lining, careful not to wet it through. The smell is manageable. You'll finish by sprinkling the inside with a powdered blend of dried herbs and chalk lavender to calm, sage to purify, and chalk to absorb whatever else lingers there. The wig is replaced on its stand, curls freshly arranged. You wipe your hands on a cloth, then sanitize the brush with a few drops of spirits. 1 down, 4 to go. Somewhere above, a bell rings. Another appointment, another hairpiece, another persona to tend. All the world's a stage, and someone has to curl the wigs backstage. Some tasks required speed, others demanded strength. But the quietest job of all might have been the most nerve-wracking cleaning Queen Victoria's bedroom, or rather, a lady's chamber of comparable station. Because while every room in the house had its rules, this one had rituals. Dusting wasn't just housekeeping, it was choreography. You enter at dawn, feet barely making a sound on the thick carpet. The room is dim lit only by the milky gray of morning light through lace curtains. Velvet drapes hang still. The scent is unmistakable, a blend of rosewater, lavender sachets, and faint coal smoke from the extinguished fire. You breathe it in, then set to work. Every movement must be silent, not quiet silent. No clinks, no coughs, no broom bristles against floorboards. Even your skirts have been hemmed shorter for this specific room so as not to rustle. You begin with a feather duster, real ostrich plumes dyed dark brown, and work your way across the marble-topped dresser, around the porcelain figurines, past the lace-covered water jug. One misstep here could end more than your day. Victorian bedrooms, especially those of royalty or aristocracy, were layered in fragile luxuries. Hand-painted ceramics, glass, scent bottles, tiny silver clocks. All beautifully arranged, all precariously balanced. You learn to dust without lifting to polish, without disturbing. Your hands glide like whispers. Queen Victoria herself was famously private. It's said her room remained almost entirely unchanged after Prince Albert's death, right down to his untouched shaving kit. And though few servants were ever allowed beyond the threshold, the practice of dusting such spaces filtered down into aristocratic imitation. The Queen's silence, they called it, working in such stillness that even floorboards refused to creak. There's disagreement among historians about how frequently these rooms were cleaned. Some believe it was a daily ritual, others argue for a more cautious weekly schedule, especially in rooms used less often. But anecdotal evidence shows a common rule: no noise, no trace, no scent of labor left behind. You move to the writing desk, now eyes scanning for specks. There, a bit of ash perhaps from yesterday's letter sealing. You swipe it gently, then realign the blotter and inkwell with reverent precision. One maid once confessed she measured the angle of her employer's quill, daily convinced she'd be tested. She never was. Still, she kept measuring. At the dressing table, you dust between hairpins, perfumes, and embroidered handkerchiefs. A comb still holds a single strand of hair. Chestnut curling slightly. You leave it undisturbed, and then the bed. A towering thing draped in white netting and heavy brocade with pillows so perfectly plumped they look untouched. You smooth the coverlet with flat palms, pulling just once at the corner to remove a wrinkle only you can see. You step back. Everything's as it was. Everything is still. You slip out feather duster tucked under your arm like a secret. The door closes with a soft click. Upstairs, the lady of the house will rise to a room that looks untouched by human hands. That's the point. You'd think royalty smelled like roses and fresh linen. And sometimes they did. But often, especially in summer, they didn't. Not because they were unclean, but because plumbing was primitive ventilation, poor, and fragrances only mask so much. And so, the nose became your silent adversary. You descend to the storage cupboard, unlocking a small wooden chest tucked beside the vinegar barrels. Inside, your olfactory arsenal. Dried lavender bunches of rosemary cloth, sachets of crushed sage lemon peels curled into fragrant spirals, and a bottle labeled Simply Spirits of Camphor. It smells like medicine and morning. The hallway upstairs always held a particular scent, wood polish, hot wool, and people. Sometimes too many people. Servants were tasked with keeping the smell of life from offending the noses of those who preferred only the scent of status. That meant open windows in the morning briefly, and only if the weather allowed, followed by discreet airing of sheets, re-scenting of garments, and periodic vinegar fumigations. You fill a small dish with vinegar and tuck it behind a curtain. In the hallway, you scatter rosemary sprigs between floorboards. A sachet goes under a pillow. This was scent work, subtle, slow, and always undone by the next sweaty overcoat or boiled cabbage dinner. Some historians suggest that these odor rituals were more psychological than practical, designed to reassure mistresses that their homes were pure. Others argue they genuinely worked, pointing to letters that praised certain households for their freshness. Either way, the burden fell on the invisible noses of servants like you. Even chamber pots weren't spared your sensory management. Once emptied, they were rinsed with a vinegar solution and dried in the sun, then sprinkled with herbs, or, if you were lucky, a pinch of imported powder that smelled vaguely of citrus and ambition. The grander homes had scent clocks, elaborate contraptions that released perfumes at timed intervals, usually when guests arrived. But in most houses, it was a handful of servants with handfuls of mint battling the unrelenting force of humanity. One housemaid recounted placing fresh lemon rinds inside the boots of a particularly musty footman. Another swore by cloves tucked into pockets. Better a spice rack than a scandal she wrote in a letter she never sent. Today you light a pastille, a small perfume pellet, pressed with herbs and resin. It smokes gently from its dish-curling tendrils of clove and pine into the air. The smell clings to your sleeves and tickles your throat, but it will fade before anyone notices. That's the goal. As you move from room to room, your kit in tow, you begin to recognize which family members smell like lavender and which prefer orange blossom. You keep notes in your head. You scent their world so quietly they never notice. And when one guest remarks, "How lovely your home always smells," the lady of the house will smile and nod, never realizing you spent the morning wrestling rosemary behind her chaise longue. The nose knows. And yours does too. By now, your hands have scrubbed, your shoulders have carried, and your nose has done more heavy lifting than you'd ever admit. But nothing quite prepares you for the grimy battlefield of hygiene hierarchies, the unspoken ranking of cleanliness chores in a Victorian household. Because not all dirt was created equal, and not all servants got to clean the same kind. You start the day with linens, perhaps, or silver polishing. Tasks that, while tedious, are socially acceptable. But as the list trickles downward from hand towels to chamber pots, you feel the shift. There's an invisible line between dutiful and degrading, and you're about to cross it. You're handed the chamber pot brush. Some households assigned entire categories of hygiene by rank. The lady's maid might wash hairbrushes, perfume bottles, and gloves. But the undermaid, she scrubbed chamber pots, cleaned privy stools, and aired mattress pads that no one dared inspect too closely. Worst of all was the scullery maid, who not only did dishes but also emptied slops from bedrooms and wiped down the servants' own shared privy. You carry the porcelain pot, carefully arms extended. It's surprisingly heavy. You don't think about the contents, though. You know you will later when you're elbow deep in vinegar rinse. You tip it into the outdoor drain nose turned mouth shut. Victorian homes lacked modern plumbing in most rooms. Even wealthy estates operated on a system of jug and basin washing, with indoor chamber pots tucked discreetly beneath ornate beds. These had to be emptied daily before breakfast without spills, and preferably without comment. One slip, one stain on the hallway rug, and your name would be whispered with wrinkled noses for weeks. Historians disagree on whether this division of labor was more about class or convenience. Some argue that senior servants earned cleaner duties by tenure. Others suggest that the dirtiest jobs were deliberately reserved for young girls, those least able to refuse. Regardless, the result was clear: someone always ended up scrubbing what others couldn't bear to speak of. You rinse the pot with vinegar and water, then scrub the inner bowl with a brush that's seen better centuries. The rim is chipped, the handle slick. You wipe it down, dry it with a rag, and return it to its hiding place under the bed, all without a sound. There's a sort of bleak camaraderie in these duties. Overheard whispers among staff trade chamber, pot horror stories like war veterans recalling battles. Lady C's pot had lemon peels in it yesterday, someone might say. Better than what I found in the bishop's, another will reply, eyes wide. You laugh not because it's funny, but because the alternative is crying into soap suds. As you scrub the final pot, you glance at your hands cracked red and faintly perfumed with vinegar and rose. You wonder who decided which jobs mattered most, who drew the line between noble service and necessary filth. But there's no time for that now. Another bell rings, and wherever there's a bell, there's probably a mess behind it. There's something deceptive about bathing day. It sounds serene, doesn't it? A gentle soak, maybe lavender in the air, perhaps a harp playing softly in the background. But if you're a servant in a Victorian household, bathing day is less spa retreat and more strategic disaster management, especially if it's the master who decides to bathe. You enter the washroom like a soldier entering a minefield. The tub still glistens from your earlier scrubbing, the water's been boiled and hauled, and the scent of camphor oil hangs in the air like nervous anticipation. You're already damp with effort, your apron clinging to your ribs. And the gentleman hasn't even removed his dressing gown yet. Bathing was rare enough that when it did happen, it happened big. A once-weekly soak for most, sometimes fortnightly in the chillier months. When a master bathed, it was an event: extra towels, cologne, new linens, and 2 staff on standby. And that's not even accounting for accidents. You recall last month's scald. A misjudged kettle emptied too quickly and the water temperature shot from tepid to lobster. There was a shout, a splash, and then silence. Until, of course, the shouting resumed this time about how I should have been ready in case. That's the thing about bathing day: too hot, and it's your fault. Too cold, still your fault. And if someone slips, well, you might be polishing floors until Easter. One maid reported in a letter that she once had to fish a fallen soap dish from between her employer's knees without looking directly at anything above the tub's edge. Another was reprimanded for drying a foot too bracingly. No one teaches you these things. You just learn one damp misstep at a time. There is no scholarly consensus on how bathing habits evolve within the servant class. Some claim that because they had to assist so frequently, servants avoided full baths themselves, favoring sponge baths or public bath houses. Others argue that many developed routines of their own early morning, late evening, using leftover water when no one was watching. Today the challenge is avoiding the puddle by the hearth, where a towel's already slipped. You move quickly, silently mopping with one foot, while balancing a tray of fresh underclothes. The bathwater sloshes as the master shifts reaching for the sponge. You brace, you wait. You try not to imagine the splash radius. And then it happens, a thud, a barked order, a soaked sleeve. You lunge forward to retrieve the dropped flannel, just as water spills over the tub's edge, cascading onto the polished floorboards like a small tidal wave. The second towel isn't enough. The third disappears completely beneath the flood. You manage it just barely. No curses, no slaps on the wrist. Just a long exhale from the bath and a dismissive wave. You bow, collect the sodden mess, and back out of the room like a retreating diplomat. Behind you, the tub ripples gently. Ahead of you, wet footprints mark your retreat. The towels are now piled in the laundry basket, your arms soaked to the elbows and your shoes squelch with every step. You might think the worst is over, but no, because even when the tubs are drained and the flannels are hung to dry, there's one final duty no one discusses aloud: collecting the wash rags. You re-enter the washroom. Once it's cleared, the steam beginning to dissipate, hanging like ghosts around the window panes. The flannel cloths lie in a damp heap beside the tub. You gather them one by one, each holding traces of the bodies they once scrubbed. And as you do, you begin to hear it again, the whispers, not from the house, from us. The laundry rooms were many things: humid, loud, miserable, but they were also sanctuaries of speech. It was where servants could trade quiet observations, muttered complaints, and the kinds of stories that would never appear in a guest book. And nothing invited gossip like shared linen. She used 3 cloths this morning, one maid might say, hanging out a flannel with exaggerated reverence. What was she trying to scrub away? Another might whisper about the new footman's shirt being mysteriously in the laundry twice in one day. The rags themselves became shorthand. A lace-trimmed washcloth meant higher rank. The rough beige cloths signaled lower. The perfume that lingered told you whose hand had pressed it to skin. And if a cloth came back stained in a particular way, well, let's just say some stains told stories. Of course, none of this ever made it to the ledger books. Historians only glimpse it in fragments, passing mentions in servant diaries, cheeky lines buried in personal letters, or brief footnotes in larger tomes about household management. Still, scholars speculate that gossip was the true currency of service washed wrung and hung out to dry. You fold the rags and place them into the basket. They're heavier than they look, not just with water, but with memory. Back in the laundry, you pass 2 other maids wringing linens. One raises an eyebrow. Her ladyship's new lotion smells like violets, she murmurs. The other grins. Or, like someone wants us to think she's delicate. It's not malicious, this gossip. Not really. It's survival. A way to make sense of your place in a house where you touch every private item but own nothing. Where you know everything and are supposed to say nothing. As you rinse the cloths in lavender water, the room slowly quiets. The jokes subside. The whispers fold into the sound of dripping cloth and sloshing pails. You hang the final rag on the line. It sways gently beside its kin, just another anonymous square in a curtain of secrets. You step back, stretch your shoulders, and breathe in the mingled sense of soap starch and speculation. And somewhere beneath it all, you wonder if linen could talk. Whose voice would it use? The laundry is hung, the baths are done, and the buckets at last are empty. You sit on a low stool in the scullery, fingers blistered in damp skirt, hem stiff with dried soap. It's near midnight. Upstairs, the final lamps are being extinguished. Down here, all that's left is the quiet sound of dripping cloth and your own breath. You lean your head back against the cool brick wall and close your eyes just for a moment. What would it be like, you wonder, to live in a world where water came from taps, not pumps, where soap appeared with a squeeze, not a prayer, where baths drew themselves with a flick of a switch and no one had to carry a kettle in either hand? It sounds like sorcery, but it also sounds like mercy. Among the servant class dreams didn't often include carriages or castles. They included plumbing, hot water on demand, flush toilets that needed no scrubbing, machines that washed clothes without blisters. Some maids dreamed of America not for wealth or romance, but because they had heard rumors of indoor bathrooms on every floor. Some historians dismiss these longings as retrospective fantasy, the kind layered in by modern imaginations. But letters from the time tell a different story. In one, a housemaid in Kent wrote to her sister about a rumor that a neighbor's employer had installed gas water heaters. If it's true, she wrote, I might cry with joy. In another letter, a laundress described her envy at a newly married couple who'd been gifted a hand-cranked wringer. They won't have to twist towels till their wrists ache, she marveled. Imagine that. You open your eyes and stare at your reflection in the water barrel beside you. The ripple distorts your features, but there you are, tired upright still here. Not just surviving, but imagining. These daydreams often passed in silence, shared only in glances, or over whispered tea. A new pipe seen in the pantry, a rumor about a lady's cousin installing a flushing toilet. Someone had seen a photograph of a house where every room had a basin with its own water tap. You'd all lean in closer towels, half-folded minds briefly elsewhere. Here in the scullery, the candle flickers low. The basin is finally clean. And though your arms ache and your back feels like it's been bricked in your mind, still drifts toward warmth, toward ease, toward a future not yet here, but maybe just close enough to imagine. You blow out the candle. In the dark, the sound of dripping continues like a lullaby. You pull your shawl tighter, curl your feet under you, and rest your head against the stone. Tomorrow will bring more washing, more water, more rags, more soap that disappears too quickly. But for now, in this stillness, you are somewhere else, somewhere clean. The scullery fades into quiet, the dripping stops, and the shadows stretch long and slow across the worn flagstone floor. Somewhere above the great house sleeps its polished brass and scented linens, none the wiser to the hands that made them shine. You remain still in the hush, wrapped in wool and weariness, in a kind of dignity no ledger ever recorded. All the scrubbing, lifting, boiling, folding, it all recedes into the background now, like steam curling toward a ceiling beam. Let yourself drift as they did in those rare moments between duties. Imagine soft water running from a tap. Imagine beds that warm themselves. Imagine a world where hands are clean because the work is lighter, not because someone else did it first. Sleep comes quietly here. No bells, no pails, just peace. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you listening? From what time is it there? And who's your favorite forgotten historical worker?